I can't, you're muted, I think.
I'm sorry, I was listed third, so I just want to make sure people
Unmute
are
yourself and
okay.
still muted, I believe. Can
Am I
you,
muted? You're okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Junann Greeley. I'm from Sacred Heart University.
can you all hear
And
Junann?
yes.
I don't hear her. Okay.
Other people. Should I continue? Okay. So I'm going to begin, and I'll just kind of go right into it. So my paper is At the Foot of the Mount, a meditation on Dante's Purgatorio as a pandemic vade mecum. And this is, I'll just kind of go right into it and leave introductions for later. The British medievalist, Dante scholar and sometime mystery writer, Dorothy Sayers, once wrote of the Purgatorio that, quote, "Of the three books of the Commedia, the Purgatorio is for English readers the least known, the least quoted, and the most beloved. If a reader can walk at ease in death's second kingdom, then he is a true citizen of the Dantean Empire. The Inferno may fill one with only an appalled fascination, and Paradiso may daunt one by its intellectual severity, but if one is drawn to the Purgatorio at all, it is by the cords of love. Purgatorio is the dearest, subtlest, and most human section of the comedy." Similarly, a celebrated German scholar of late medieval and early modern European literature, Helmut Hatzfeld, wrote somewhat begrudgingly that, quote, "While Dante's Inferno is a very earthly world and the Paradiso a spiritualization which almost neglects the human element, the art of Purgatorio consists in the creation of a very human magic myth, including the poetization of theology, spiritual life, human relations, liturgy, landscapes, and situations. Modern readers, under its cathartic spell, cannot help feeling already with Dante, the thread sewing their envious eyes and the heavy stone destined to curb their pride." I begin with these appraisals of Dante's Purgatorio to underscore the fact that the literary consensus about the Cantica, that it is of the entire Divine Comedy, the most intimate, human, and humane, does not lighten the burdens that Purgatorio levies on both the teacher and student alike. Purgatorio is the Cantica in which Dante most deliberately ruminates about the immense and difficult questions of the human condition. It is the Cantica that is most concerned with the actual matter of human life on earth. That is, how to live gently, how to live humbly, what is justice, how to live honestly, that in a word, how to live virtuously. The questions Dante raises in Purgatorio offer no easy responses, but confront the reader with persistent inquiries about the constitutive dimensions of a meaningful and purposeful life on earth. And for some, depending on your orientation, in preparation for the blessing of salvation. Thus, as Hatzfeld suggests, Purgatorio is Dante's unblinking glare at each one of us, demanding that we look now, not later, at the condition of our individual souls, as well as be more readily aware of the moral condition of others. That we each accept now, not later, our personal agency in the road to salvation, or for the unbelieving, most of my students, our agency in the creation of a just society directed toward the common good. And that we each recognize now the measure of self-awareness and self-understanding that is necessary for the fulfillment of such agency. Purgatorio is Dante's cautionary counsel that not devils, but the crucial elements of human flourishing and salvation are in the details of human life. However, it's true that for 21st century post-millennium students, most of which we're teaching, even those who claim adherence to the Roman Catholic faith, purgatory is either too abstracted a concept to be justifiable or is simply an indefensible one. The inclusion of such a seemingly extensive prolongation of final salvation thwarts the simple binary possibility of being saved or not. And it seems to make the whole matter of salvation less efficient and seemingly less attainable. For my non-religious student, any doctrine related to life after death, in fact, any kind of afterlife, is simply irrelevant in its implausibility. Moreover, in this time of COVID-19, when the human condition is so fraught with ambiguity and vulnerability, the notion of judgment at death, when so many unanticipated deaths have been so prominent as to question whether there is a moral arc to the universe, seems inappropriate, even impertinent, yet somehow beguiling. The pandemic has caused us, particularly I would say our students, but really all of us, to hit pause and offered us space to become more reflective, introspective about our individual lives, but even also about our collective agency in sustaining communities that have been rent from us. So the question now might not just be how should we live, but whether it matters. The second cantica of the Divine Comedy, Purgatorio, can become an appealing study for any student because it is, as Dorothy Sayers attested, the most human of the Divine Comedy. It explores the range of content that addresses the questions of our humanity that require no belief or dogmatic instruction to contemplate. Is there meaning in our existence? Is there free will? What is the nature of the human soul? Is there a soul? What is the nature of sin or of will? Is there forgiveness? What is it to be virtuous? And so on. Does it matter and how we have to live justly? Purgatorio affords students a common space for personal reflection and evolving narration for class discussion on any several of those many questions. I was just teaching it today, this morning, so it's fresh in my mind. And this interlude of the pandemic, as well as the post-pandemic era towards which we are creeping steadily, has made those questions more vital than ever in directing students and really all of us toward answers that might become adhesives for an increasingly fragmented and fractured lives. Now, of course, I'm not going to go into the theological development, the idea of purgatorio, except to say that some students find it, even the non-religious students, a rather interesting discussion about whether there's an afterlife and how this idea kind of evolved. I will say in reference to Dante, however, that when he was penning the Cantica in the 14th century, it was a time that when, as the result of plagues and wars and other variables of an evolving society and global outreach, concerns arose in society about how best to order increasingly pluralistic lives. With what mechanisms or orders of ideas could such societies secure wholeness and promote justice, and how best to integrate the increasingly important individual into societies for the flourishing of self and others. And there's no question that the systematic organization of Purgatorio, its serene order and carefully layered ascent to paradise, its tone of hope and possibility, and its voice of reason and revelation demonstrate Dante's optimism, really important for students, that champions both a collective and singular capacity to ascend out of and beyond the condemnation of chaos, despair, darkness, isolation, and confusion that the pandemic, for example, has wrought. It is important for students to realize the confidence of Dante's vision and the positive movement of the entire Cantica. Dante and Virgil, as we know, and this is probably speaking to the choir, but anyway, Dante and Virgil walk out of the depths of hell, and they begin to ascend steadily up a mount of purgatory, which is the locus of cleansing and enlightenment for all souls who are there, and all who, by the way, are saved, until Dante achieves the summit of earthly paradise that is a gateway to heaven, to joy, to awakening. Since so many of them teeter, this is all important for our students, since so many of them teeter on the verge of despair after young lifetimes of school shootings, economic collapses, terrorist threats, and of course, the global health crisis. Dante's narrative, howsoever fictive and creative, does hearten students with hope, but also urges them to recognize it's not enough just to hope, or not enough just to emerge from a dark place. One must understand, but one must also act according to a better, more virtuous model of human behavior. Purgatorio offers them at least a kind of roadmap from the continuing journey of renewed integration and human flourishing. As such, in terms of teaching Purgatorio, I find that it's crucial to remind them that all the souls, unlike Inferno, which is pretty much all they ever know is the Inferno, are already saved, albeit in a protracted ascension to the light. And these souls are distant from the unchanging and unchangeable damned in the Inferno and the rarefied elect in Paradiso. It tends to be the Cantica which is the comedy, the Inferno, the comedy, Cantica of the comedy that the students are most familiar with. Dante opens Purgatorio with some of the most joyous verses of deliverance in medieval poetry. These are essential for an appreciation for the second Cantica and the progress of Dante's pilgrimage. And I'm quoting Durling here, just the opening lines of Canto 1. To run through better waters, the little ship of my wit now hoists its sails, leaving behind it a sea so cruel. And I will sing of that second realm, where the human spirit purges itself and becomes worthy to ascend to heaven. But here, let dead poetry rise up again, O holy muses, since I am yours. And here, let Calliope arise somewhat, accompanying my song, with that sound of which the wretched magpies so felt the blow, they despaired of pardon. The sweet color of Eastern sapphire, gathering in the cloudless aspect of the air, pure to the first circle, began to delight my eyes again, as soon as I came forth from the dead air that had weighed my eyes and breast with sorrow. It is dawn on Monday after Easter Sunday, the first light of a new world after the resurrection of Christ, or just the dawn of a new world. And so it is the beginning of a new poem, a new sensibility that floods the verses of Purgatorio. There is renewal and regeneration, even after so dense and deep a time of corrosion and deterioration. Dante speaks now of waters, the cleansing streams of redemption, that now carry him as a poet on a little ship of wit away from the cruel and noxious sea of the Inferno. Dante alludes to the resurrection of his poetic sensibility, let dead poetry rise up again, on the dawning of the day at the resurrection of Christ, a perfect conflation of Dante pilgrim and Dante poet. Through Christ's act, Dante, as both pilgrim and poet, can now see in the blaze of pure light and color and catch the cleansing breath. The noted Dante scholar Giuseppe Mazzotta makes much of the comparative adjective better in the opening stanzas as in the better waters. It is a point with noting for students. Dante uses better not only to emphasize that he no longer tarries in the toxic wasteland of Inferno, but also that his ascent to the light, as it were, is a gradual process, a continuum, good, bad, better, good, better, best, and so on. Mazzotta encourages readers to, quote, use the comparative adjective here, the better waters, is Dante's emphasis on the journey as a comparatively good one. It is not the best of waters, it's not the worst, these are better. We are really on the way to better things. It's a world of degree that Dante introduces, for he is never in a dualistic world divided between what's bad and what's good. Again, a very important concept for our students. There are many meditations and steps along the route to paradise, and he's introduced this notion along with this one adjective. The journey through Purgatorio then is a gradual process, a continuum, as Mazzotta said, of gaining virtue, shedding vice in order to become worthy to ascend to heaven. In this regard, Dante ascribed to the idea of the great philosopher Thomas Aquinas, who learned it from Aristotle actually, that virtue, as we know, is a power of the soul that curated and cultivated consistently by understanding and action over time, can establish the penitent along the path of salvation in ascent to the kingdom. To put it in more familiar or secular terms, especially for our students, we each must nurture virtue in thought, yes, but also deed, until it becomes almost habitual. It is in that way we will achieve some condition of our own happiness and a kind of flourishing for ourselves, yes, but also for our communities. The movement of the pilgrim in Purgatorio is a steady progression of enlightenment, moral, intellectual, and spiritual, the gaining of virtue in cumulative stages. However, it's been suggested the process cannot just be a movement forward. Dante argues rather that the process must involve reflection and contemplation of behaviors, decisions, and choices, an honest assessment of those occasions when disordered or insufficient love has so afflicted the soul to cause kind of a corrupt behavior or iniquitous acts. And of course, the Purgatorio is designed as a mountain with the 7 deadly sins in the ascent, of course, going up to the mountain. He begins with pride and ascending then envy, wrath, the great perversion of love, sloth becomes a defective love, avarice, gluttony, and lust, excessive love for the wrong object. And if we note that the lowest levels of the mountain of purgatory are those which are nearest to the depths of hell and are greatly removed from happiness, are those which are most in need of recalibration and are also the most destructive. That becomes pride, envy, and wrath. We should also note that for Dante, these deadly sins, these vices, these iniquitous behaviors, these disordered loves are actually mostly social sins. That is, not only are they destructive of the individual, but they are particularly destructive of the common weal and of human relationships. And they are corruptive of those relationships. Dante was troubled by the erosion of the common good that he witnessed in his fluctuating and dysfunctional late medieval Italian community, as we should perhaps be about ours. Of course, during the pandemic, the students did pause, and some might have taken time to assess where they had been, where they might be going. But many people, it seems, especially perhaps young people, were almost too anxious to endeavor such work, especially slow work, if it had to be accomplished alone. They needed, or still need, we all need, a Virgil. And so in a fitting recalibration, Dante's text itself can become a Virgil, a guide for personal meditation. The structure of the purgatorial process as Dante envisioned it was unlike that of the Inferno, where the intractable dramas of condemnation articulate each level of descent. In Purgatorio, Dante initiates each level of the ascent up the mount with exemplars first of the relevant virtue against the specific sin or vice, in an effort to emphasize what is a better path of living rather than focus on what mistakes have been made. Dante usually incorporated scenes from the life of the Virgin and other known historical literary figures as exemplars of the virtue, and only after those figures spoke their truth were then their examples given of the sin or vice or misbehavior itself. The ascent of Mount Purgatory offers a persistent continuance of soul growth through moral discernment. Now, time will not permit, obviously, a thorough examination of each of these categories of disordered love. that Dante has presented. So I will look very briefly only at one of them, the mount or the level, the cornice of envy, the sin that my students at least readily identify as the most remorseless and destructive of all, and one that they say is a pervasive presence in their communities, notably as a consequence, they believe, of the pervasive influence of social media and other virtual agents of reality. So very quickly, envy. As has been noted, Dante defined envy along with pride and wrath as the worst perversion of Christian love, or caritas. It is a disordered devotion to the self that deflates any humane behavior through vagaries of malice and resentment. In fact, the medieval world regarded envy, or invidia, as an exceptionally malevolent sin because of its exceptionally insidious and malicious nature. Envy is not simply jealousy over what another has, or greed for another's profit, or anger at another's success, or lust for another's accomplishment. Rather, envy is a pernicious witch's brew of all those sins hardened by deep-seated feelings of bitterness, indignation, and antipathy that combine to inspire a yearning, this is the essence of envy, that the other person be injured or suffer somehow because of what he has or she has. Aquinas identified envy as a mortal sin and the capital vice because it is most contrary to caritas, or Christian love, with that which gives the life to the human soul and animates the human spirit towards God and good in one's neighbor. Envy was the compulsion that goaded the pride of Lucifer to defy God. Envy was the root of the wrath that Cain inflicted upon Abel. Envy truly is at the core of all sin. As Dante and Virgil ascend to the terrace of envy, and this is around Canto 13, and as the Dante scholar Theodolinda Bartolini explains, here we see another reminder that the job of the Mountain of Purgatory is to provide a kind of aggressive cognitive therapy with the goal of dishabituating us from vice, the inclination to sin. And so the canto begins, we now had reached the summit of the stairs where once again the mountain whose ascent delivers man from sin has been indented. There, just as the case of the first terrace, a second terrace runs around the slope, except that it describes a sharper arc. No effigy is there, no outline. The bank is visible, the naked path, only the livid color of raw rock. The terrace of envy is dull and pallid as stone, a livid color. And because in life vision was the fuel to the fire of envy, on the terrace of the envious there is nothing to see. There's no visual, no effigy, the path is naked. Rather, when Dante and Virgil first come upon the scene, they hear haunting voices. When we heard spirits as they flew towards us, though they could not be seen, spirits pronouncing courteous invitations, the first voice that flew by us called out loud, "Venum non habent," and behind that, another voice reiterated its example. Then a second voice proclaimed, "I am Orestes," and a third voice is heard to intone, "Love thy enemies." Those airy words of greeting explain the virtue that most effectively counteracts envy and diminishes its influence, the virtue of caritas. "We do not have wine" was a plea from Mary to Jesus, beseeching him to help find wine for the wedding at Cana. The shout of "I am Orestes" comes from Cicero's De Amicitia, also invokes John 15:13. The moment when not Orestes and John, but God, no greater love have man. The moment when Orestes attempts to stand in for his friend Pylades, who was destined to be killed as he had stood in for Orestes. And finally, the teaching from the Sermon on the Mount to love not just neighbors, but also enemies. And we should note that this is the only place in the whole Cantica that quotes the actual words of Jesus. The three comments do not merely define caritas for two pilgrims and for us readers, they offer models of behavior with others in the world that correct the acquisitive and malevolent taint of envy. Again, Dante wants to move beyond words to actual acts of redemption, and should be known that the examples of caritas here often excite an animated conversation among my students, especially during these pandemic and politically raucous times when love of an enemy or caring about the well-being of another might not be not only unwelcome, but sometimes ill-advised for them. As Dante and Virgil walk on, they encounter the souls on the ledge of envy, fated to make amends for their sins, although they are ultimately saved, as are all the souls in purgatory. The souls are enrobed in a haircloth and they sit huddled together, pressing against the cold stone wall, unable to see since their eyelids have been sewn shut with iron wire. And as their eyes were, of course, as we said, the initial entry point for envy and their envious obsession. Yet the experience of the Dante pilgrim and his encounters with the soul in Purgatorio is distinct from the adventures of the Inferno. While populations of the damned who Dante pilgrim encountered in hell were souls of those still contaminated by sinfulness, who refuse and will continue to refuse to be accountable for their wickedness, or could imagine no other condition of being, the sinners in purgatory, such as the envious, do manifest some repentance for sins while still alive, and are still willing to realize both what could be lost without penance and what must be accomplished in order to move closer to God and each other. The souls in purgatory are self-aware, they're accountable. Another point of some discussion with my students. As one denizen of the Ledge of Envy explains to Dante Pilgrim, quote, the lines 124 to 29, I was of Siena, replied the shade, and with these others, here I mend my sinful life, weeping to him that he may lend himself to us. Sapia was my name, though I was far from wise, for I rejoiced much more at harm done others than at my own good fortune. I sought my peace with God at the very last, and penitence would not have yet reduced the debt had it not been for Peter the comb seller, who in his charity was grieved me and remembered me in his devout petitions. The lament of the self-identified Sienese exemplifies the souls of the penitent in purgatory. Before anything else, Sapia acknowledges her sinfulness, her hope of God's grace, and her own inability to ascend to God without mercy. She thus clarifies to Dante Pilgrim why there are envious souls in purgatory as well in hell. Sapia admits her envious disposition while alive. Sapia was my name. I was far from wise. I rejoiced more in the harm done others than at my own fortune. But she also narrates how she came to realize her moral failure. I sought peace with God at the last, that at the end led her to and still leads her to seek God's forgiveness for what she had done. Such confessions of guilt that recognize personal failing and not another's at the root of transgressions are clear opposition to situations in the inferno, which the dwellers of which remain defiant in their refusal to be accountable. The matter of personal accountability and this idea of responsibility does also become a reflective topic for students. Purgatorio reveals another aspect of salvation or liberation from sin or vice, whatever is relevant to each student, that is often compelling. Salvation, a rescue from loss, a rescue from depression, a condition of moral lassitude, is not for Dante a solo venture. One does not go it alone. As Dante insists throughout the Divine Comedy, but especially Purgatorio, the most human of the Ficantica, life is at best a relational journey, only truly realized in human connection and Christian love for one another, typified by Dante himself on his partner descent to paradise, first Virgil, then Beatrice, then Saint Bernard, or by the many souls he encounters. As Dante explains in the words of Sapia, her own singular penitence was not sufficient. Human mercy and forgiveness from others are also part of the path to redemption. Sapia thus bears witness to Dante's truth that human compassion and sincere care are how we save each other, howsoever a student understands the notion of saved, even in the worst times. So to conclude.
I'm running a little low on time.
Okay, very quickly. I'll just go very quickly. Dante's Divine Comedy is a bountiful source of the classroom discussion, ethical debate, anachronistic as the text might seem. The richness of the Commedia is universality and its prodigious content that can be explored meaningfully even without dallying over obscure names, unfamiliar places, and discrete data. The Commedia, particularly Purgatorio, offers the contemporary audience a journey into the torn and messy and stained fabric of human life with its errant passions, tempers, and hurts. Yet the journey does not, in the end, abide in darkness. It is a comedy after all, so the narration tends to the light, that is of hope, that lingers at the end of the journey, nor is it a vain hope or a false positivity. The image and voices that Dante presents in his poem offer students the opportunity to reflect on themselves in relation to themselves, personally, as well as community with others, to regard the pervasive consequences of actions, but also attitudes of being, and to consider thus the social and communal nature of every human life. The voices in Purgatorio especially invite readers or our students to begin their own journey of reflection about what makes for a good life, what makes a life good and just or happy. Students may not agree with Dante on any score, but his work challenges them to begin to ask the great and significant questions. What is it to be human? What are human sins? And so on. Amid all the timeless existential questions of life, Dante also prods the reader to reflect on each life as a mark of moral agency, to understand that actions and behaviors have physical, spiritual, emotional consequences that often far exceed the temporal moment of the event. And for each action, every behavior, each of us is responsible. The degree to which each of us accepts such responsibility and holds himself accountable, not just to himself or to God, but even to each other, very well may determine the course of human history. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Sorry.
That's a presentation we all might envy. Let's turn to Jody Watkins now, please.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, just fine.
Okay, wonderful. I'm here with, that's Neil Armstrong in the background. He's one of our guys, and he's helping me cover up the fact that my office is a mess. So, So this essay is a personal one for me. Its purpose is to report on the success of a special project we offered our students at Purdue to use their core text to help them frame their own pandemic experience. But in my own mind, it's a tribute to the two things referenced in the subtitle of the talk: resilient students and transformative texts. Those two things have collectively been my joy and my preoccupation over decades of teaching in integrated liberal arts programs, first at the now sadly defunct St. Joseph's College in Indiana, and now at Purdue University. So the story starts with a contest. In the fall of 2020, the Cornerstone Integrated Liberal Arts program at Purdue encouraged students enrolled in the two transformative text courses to submit original essays, poetry, artwork, and other material that reflected both their personal pandemic journeys, as well as how their course texts had helped them think through the many transformations accompanying this journey. Their responses were optimistic, sometimes angry, sometimes heartbreaking, and heartwarming. And their use of the core text to help them express these emotions was creative and gratifying. Many of the essays echoed the theme that the pandemic had engendered frustration and loss, but also invaluable new insights and personal change for the better. The main title of this essay, "A Joy It Will Be One Day, Perhaps, to Remember Even This," is a line from Virgil's origin myth for Rome, the Aeneid. At this point, Aeneas is trying to raise the spirits of his exhausted Trojan crew after they'd been blown off course by a brutal storm. Only 7 of their ships remained. After that storm, the rest of the fleet had disappeared beneath the waves. And as the leader fated to help the Trojan people find a new homeland after Troy was destroyed, it fell to Aeneas to address them in their sorrow and fatigue. Hope and resilience is the sense of what he offered the Trojans. The storm was, after all, only the latest obstacle in their journey. They'd already come through so much. They needed to continue to be the resilient people that they'd already proven themselves to be. In his contest submission, one of my students found echoes of these words from ancient literature in our present situation in terms of how people navigate lives that have been quickly and drastically transformed. While admitting that the pandemic has meant longing to go back to what was once considered normal, as the Trojans themselves must have wished they could do, the time of struggle also meant new friendships, experiences, and lessons that he noted would not have happened otherwise. What this student and others showed me in their contest essays was resilience, almost in the sense that a physicist might use it, of that ability to absorb energy and to project it outward as you bounce back, absorbing energy from all the blows that you receive. In other words, it's kind of a creative resilience that's far more than simply grappling with and surviving struggle. It's finding energy to let struggle transform you in positive ways. The students were already resilient by the time they arrived in my classroom. Among the blows that they'd suffered were loss of family members to the pandemic. One guy had to live out of his car while still in high school. We had a brother being shot, a father with a drug addiction and legal trouble who was getting his life back on track when he was in a serious car accident. Racial incidents experienced by both Black and Asian students, not to mention the seemingly smaller but still very important loss of all those important rites of passage that mark the transition out of high school. Great literature did not make the students resilient. Rather, it gave them new words and ways to articulate and think about the changes in their lives. There were many important insights in their essays that I could share, but I would like to focus on just 2 of the more prominent ones and the voice that core text gave them to express those insights. They're simple, obvious even, but they're no less profound for that. The first is the importance of social support systems in difficult times. Two boats lashed together will never sink. A three-ply rope is not easily broken. If we help each other and fight side by side, what harm can come to us? This line from the ancient Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh comes as Gilgamesh pleads with his friend Enkidu to help him in his quest to fight the monster Humbaba. And it's a true statement about how support from someone else can make all the difference when facing hardships. The idea that a social support system makes resilience easier to develop is well known. An article in the Guardian newspaper a few years ago explored what makes some people more resilient than others. And it quotes a psychiatrist as saying that when individuals feel that someone's covering their back, they tend to use more active coping and problem-solving strategies for their distress. Several students in their contest essays referenced the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu as a way to express how important friends, family, and community members have been to their ability to cope with and overcome the many disappointments of the pandemic. This includes a simple and sweet story of a young man who got to know his future sister-in-law well as she quarantined with his family, how they would sit and work together, how she helped him study for his AP exams, and how she's now one of his closest friends and the first person he texts when something's going on at Purdue. There was a young woman who spent her quarantine hiking part of the Appalachian Trail alone. And now, inspired by the mutual support between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, has decided that her next hike, she will bring a partner so that she can, in her words, share the incredible experiences I have with someone close to my heart. Yet another student whose surgeries for a serious medical condition left him especially vulnerable said that while their story of friendship is not very realistic to today's standards, the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu is a model relationship we should strive for during these incredibly unusual and unfamiliar times. In my case, the relationships I created with the people around me were key to a healthy mindset and outlook on my current situation with surgery and the pandemic. It's not just our relationships with others that they mention, but our personal choices in how we use hardship that was the focus of many of the essays, which brings me to the second of their insights, and that's that no outcome is ever certain. Harness the journey turn it in your direction and learn to bend. So far from Aeneas's tactic of getting his people to focus on a new Trojan homeland, many students found it far more fruitful to see what they could learn along the way and the strong importance of being able to bend when the winds of change blow. One of my students encapsulated this insight especially well. It appears fruitless to focus upon a destination, especially given how important the so-called journey is. I am unable to recall how many different instances I've seen or heard the phrase "in these uncertain times." And in my mind, this primarily serves to alienate the present from the past and create this mirage as if the times have ever been certain. While our whole world has changed in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, the notions of returning to normalcy and returning to a more certain time are simply impossible. The destination, this return to normal life outside the current situation, is not what I choose to focus on, as I see the journey, the daily events, as the most important elements of life in this pandemic. Another student put it more succinctly in relation to terms like the new ordinary. Nothing is ever ordinary, and nothing will ever be simple enough to be. And as still another student put it, even more succinctly, we need to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. The notion that instead of focusing on a destination that may not even be possible, that you better be ready in hard times to turn the journey in creative and positive directions really resonated with many of them. And while they referenced several texts in expressing this, they ended up relying especially on two literary works to put into words how one should approach hard times. On the one hand, students were really moved by the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass and how Douglass, while mired in the dehumanizing institution of slavery, managed nevertheless to prepare himself for his eventual journey toward freedom. In particular, his achievement of literacy amid the most difficult of circumstances impressed the students greatly, especially given the potential consequences for him if a slave master disapproved of his attempts to better himself. As one student put it, Douglass knew that knowledge is power and was something that slave owners tried to strip slaves of in fear that they'd rebel or reach their full potentiality. Another student stated that he drew direct inspiration from Douglass. In particular, Douglass is not only learning to read and write, partly teaching himself, but also going on to teach others as well. And that student last semester began to tutor kids in math, a subject that he says he often views as a second language that I speak, the language of how the world operates. I have a deep passion for it and strive to teach others how not to see math as a class, but as a language of numbers. This has brought me joy as I'm able to teach younger kids a love for what is often regarded as the worst subject in school. So on the flip side of Douglass's harnessing his journey to eventual freedom and moving it in a positive direction, we have Chinua Achebe's larger-than-life character of Okonkwo in Things Fall Apart. And for many students, he served as a cautionary tale of what not to do when change brings hardship, even as they admit that they saw themselves in him. For Okonkwo, change and hardship came in the form of British colonial authorities and missionaries coming to his traditional Igbo village and changing it irreparably. He eventually, in frustration, kills an official messenger and then commits suicide when he realized that the rest of his clansmen were not going to walk that road of rebellion and violence against the newcomers with him. One student who admits that he's grown weary of this, in his words, dystopian narrative that we're in, nevertheless felt that Okonkwo, if he had fought through the change that caused him so much anguish, he might have been able to come to terms with it and continue to uphold his values despite the new circumstances. Instead, he chose to directly oppose the change in a futile attempt to bring back the village lifestyle that had already begun its transition into the past. It was his adamant resistance to change that ultimately destroyed him. Another student had a particularly interesting take on Okonkwo. Okonkwo helped explain America to him, just as America helped to explain Okonkwo. So how could that be? The student had kind of an interesting vantage point. He saw the pandemic unfold while living at the American Embassy in Moscow and watching the goings on in the news. And in particular, seeing what he calls American patriots being unwilling to put their lives on hold for anything or anyone other than themselves by refusing to make adjustments to the pandemic reality. When he read Things Fall Apart in the class, he kind of saw Okonkwo as a somewhat American character in a sense. Even though he's from a Nigerian village, he is kind of a American dream character almost, pull yourself up by the bootstraps type of person. But his fear of weakness, his pride, his strength, while helping him succeed in traditional Igbo society, also ended up being his tragic downfall when he killed that messenger. The student goes on to say that these John Wayne-like gunslinger characteristics exist today in the United States as well. These attitudes of standing up against authority when your own and your neighbors' lives are at risk is what led the United States to having the most COVID-19 cases in the world. So the title of this session is Seeing the Core with New Eyes. As a result of this contest, I would say that for me, it's not so much new eyes, but with renewed appreciation for how great works of literature can reach across time and geographical distance to help us understand, as it notes in the official course description of the Cornerstone program at Purdue, the pleasures and pains of being human. I've been given a reminder that using great literature to help students understand their collective and personal struggles is not frivolous. It's not somehow a lesser pursuit than understanding the pagan to Christian tradition or transition, in Beowulf, or the role of fate in the Aeneid. Those other issues don't trump the sometimes exhausted and overwhelmed STEM students that we teach need to find something that speaks to them personally in the works they read. In the Cornerstone program, we refer to our core texts as transformative texts, and there's no greater obligation that this word brings with it than to meet students where they are and provide them a chance to experience and talk about the wisdom and the comforts that these texts can provide. So.
Thank you, Jody. It's terrific. Okay, I'm going to get started right away because I do want to leave some time. I'm going to shorten my paper a bit and try to leave some time for us to talk together. My core text here is a core text about core texts, and it's Hume's 1757 essay of the Standard of Taste. ACTC's bylaws describe core texts as world classics and other texts of major cultural significance. And Hume's essay is about what makes literary core texts good. So the central problem that Hume addresses is the paradox of taste. On the one hand, people tend to believe there is no disputing taste. On the other hand, people do in fact dispute taste, and sometimes reach consensus that the work of one artist is much better than the work of another. Part of Hume's solution to this paradox is that the relative beauty, he's using the word beauty in a broader sense perhaps than we typically do today. We might want to say relative artistic merit of literary works becomes less disputable with the passage of time. He says, for example, the same Homer, who pleased at Athens and Rome 2,000 years ago, is still admired at Paris and at London. All the changes of climate, government, religion, and language have not been able to obscure his glory. Another part of Hume's solution to the paradox of taste is this. The adage, there is no disputing taste, is plausible insofar as judgments of taste are merely reports of how we feel. So if a wine tastes bitter to me but sweet to you, there's no room to argue over who is right. We're both right. But judgments of taste become disputable when they are implicit predictions about how other people will experience something, be it a glass of wine, a literary work, or human conduct. Hume points out that a man in a fever would not insist on his palate as able to decide concerning flavors, nor would one affected with jaundice pretend to give a verdict with regard to colors. This is a distinctively Humean move. Let me just break it down. First, beauty, like other sentiments, including moral sentiments, is in the mind of the beholder. Second, this sentiment is a response to the properties of what is beheld. And third, some people are better than others at judging whether an object has properties that are likely to elicit the sentiment of beauty. What makes one person a better judge than another is another question that Hume raises, and his answer is to develop an overview of the ideal critic. So he summarizes the qualifications of the ideal critic in a single sentence. Strong sense, united to delicate sentiment, improved by practice, perfected by comparison, and cleared of all prejudice. He admits that there may not be any critics who actually have all these qualifications, but he claims that his readers' concurrence that individuals who had them would be better critics is all that he needs to show in order to demonstrate that the taste of all individuals is not on an equal footing. He turns next to what I would call warranted variations, a discussion of variables with respect to which differences in taste should not be judged better or worse. First is age. He says, at 20, Ovid may be the favorite author, Horace at 40, Tacitus at 50. Second is humor, humor in the Hippocratic sense. He says, comedy, tragedy, satire, each has its partisans. Such preferences are innocent and unavoidable and can never reasonably be the object of dispute because there is no standard by which they can be decided. And the third is culture. He admits that it is hard to appreciate the arts of a society whose traditions are different from one's own. Hume ends his essay by discussing the challenge of judging art that incorporates religious or moral views that conflict with one's own. He sees no problem in tolerating speculative errors. A Christian, for example, should not be troubled by the comings and goings of Homeric gods. But he argues that certain kinds of moral defects diminish the beauty, we would say artistic merit of a work. Specifically, he says, bigotry or superstition that confound the sentiments of morality and alter the natural boundaries of vice and virtue are eternal blemishes. I try to make this plausible to my students by talking at least briefly and showing a little bit of two movies. One is D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, a groundbreaking work of cinematic art and horrifically racist. It ends, by the way, with the Ku Klux Klan suppressing Black voters. The other one is Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, which is formerly a remarkable film. And it is, of course, a celebration of Nazism. Let me talk a bit about the future of classics. Hume's little essay helps to explain what core texts are and why they should be used in higher education. Whether they were written in antiquity or written yesterday, they are classics by virtue of their capacity to please discerning readers from diverse cultures across space and time. But Hume also acknowledges that otherwise beautiful works can be eternally blemished by bigotry. This poses a problem for the future of classics, especially pertinent to America today. The problem of which I speak is illustrated by an incident that took place on a panel called the Future of Classics panel at a Society of Classical Studies conference in 2019. Daniel Padilla-Peralta, a professor of Roman history at Princeton, defended his view that the classics had been instrumental to the invention of whiteness and its continued domination. He said, if one were intentionally to design a discipline whose institutional origins and gatekeeping protocols were explicitly aimed at disavowing the legitimate status of scholars of color, one could not do better than what classics has done. Mary Frances Williams, an independent scholar from California, countered that it was imperative for classicists to stand up and defend the classics as political, literary, and philosophical foundations of European and American culture. She said, it's Western civilization, it matters because it's the West. Hasn't classics given us the concepts of liberty, equality, and democracy? Padilla replied, here's what I have to say about the vision of classics that you outlined. I want nothing to do with it. I hope the field dies, and that it dies as swiftly as possible. Well, there is a difference, of course, between the future of classics as an academic discipline and the future of classics as the works of enduring beauty and cultural significance. My concern is with the latter. And I don't pretend to have full or easy answers, but here are 4 thoughts. First, I welcome tough criticism of classics on grounds of racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry. We do ourselves and our students a disservice when we hold the greats immune from criticism of this kind. Second, I welcome the departure from the parochialism of Western classics for an education in world classics. Third, I welcome questions about the relevance of classics to contemporary problems. I find that my students gain a deeper understanding of Plato's Crito when I pair it with Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. Fourth, and finally, I think we need to help ourselves and our students think deeply about the distinction between classics themselves and the uses to which classics have been put. Consider, for example, how the Old Testament was used by the Puritans who came to America to create a new Jerusalem, how it was used by slaveholders in the antebellum South to justify slavery, and how it has been used by African-American churches since the days of slavery to inspire their fight for liberty and civil rights. Thank you. Okay, we have some time left here for questions and answers, perhaps the very most precious part of our session. So the floor is open. Scott. Unmute yourself.
Got it. Okay. I want to thank all three presenters for outstanding papers. I'm going to focus in this case on Jody's because there are some questions I would like to ask her. And Jody, these are related questions. You don't have to answer all three, or you can just sort of proceed if you wish, but bear with me on this, okay? They all are inspired by the fact that your course and the transformative courses were, as it were, capstoned by the students writing these essays, and that there was a contest for it, okay? I think this is in this connection between students actually making something themselves and being able to do that in light of their reading and discussions in class is absolutely essential, ultimately, to the continuation of humanistic liberal arts education. Enough for that. Here are the questions. Did the students appreciate that they too, as the were authors making texts, inventing their own? Do you have any sense of that? That's one question. Related. Suppose we eliminate the contest or essay writing. Do you think that the core text or your core text or their core text course would have been as effective in understanding works or in providing inspiration and hope as a function of the courses? Finally, could you judge whether their characters in some sense matured because of the course and essay? And if so, how or in what?
Jody, unmute yourself, please.
The second question was what again?
The second question was, suppose we eliminate the contest in essay writing. Suppose it didn't happen. Do you think that your core text course or theirs, I'm not sure whether it was just your course or whether rather there were students from different courses, would have been as effective in either understanding the works or in providing inspiration and hope?
Well, I think certainly the contest provided a special impetus to really think through what they had covered in the course of the semester. So I'm not sure I can really answer that question for sure, but providing the opportunity to deliberately ask them to reflect on what they'd read and how it helped them understand the pandemic experience, I think probably prompted them more, at least to connect text to their pandemic experience than if we hadn't had the contest itself. So I do think it did provide a special impetus to think about it. But I couldn't really say for sure whether they would have made these connections anyway, even without the contest. I can't say that they wouldn't. Or
Did they
would.
think of themselves, were they surprised or think of themselves at all? You know, these are STEM students, right? Were they surprised to think of themselves or find themselves as being authors?
Again, I'm not really sure I could say. It certainly, that wasn't something that particularly came out in their essays. And it wasn't just my students, there were other faculty members, students participating. I'm not sure that I really saw that coming out in their essays to be able to answer. It's a great question. I'm just not sure that I can answer it.
Well, in the future, it's accessible or something like that. If you want, you know, you can find that out. Yeah. Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Next question. Yeah, Amy, is that it?
Yeah,
Hi.
that's it. I'm
Okay,
sorry,
great.
I'm not a Zoom user and I don't know how to raise my hand on Zoom.
That's
And I
okay.
don't-
We can see your real hand. That's fine. Please.
I have a question for Jody too, about the contest and stuff. So I noticed that, and this is actually something that came up yesterday too, but I noticed that when you were talking about the students writing the papers, how they're kind of focused on the journey. Now, the Aeneid, you know, all of us that have read the whole thing through know that the focus isn't really on the journey. It's always at the end. It's the ending that it's focused on. And so because they have touched, like I find this a lot too, they touch upon something, but they don't really understand the text. So the competition, while it was good that they found these things, they didn't get an overall understanding of what the Aeneid really was or what some of these texts really were. And so it's nice that they dive into them, but sometimes that misunderstanding can lead to other things, which can cause kind of issues in academia, right, as they move along. But my question is that we were talking about wartime yesterday, and it's kind of come to my understanding that every time that we have a crisis, whether it's war or pandemic, we have this existential mindset. It's like we have to stop focusing on the end means just to survive and move through it and really focus on ourselves and the here and now. And I was just wondering if you thought that maybe when they were looking at the text that the focus was kind of already there to kind of survive in the here and now. And if you think that even though they might not have understood the whole text, that kind of helped them still move through it and that they were finding things in the text with that mindset, or if the text gave them that mindset. So I'm kind of wondering what you think of that, if that makes any sense.
The focusing on the here and now. Okay. Well, certainly our discussions, at least the way I conduct mine, I always try and find applications to the here and now. I always try and contemporize each of the readings that we have. So I kind of see to it, I guess, that they do focus on some contemporary issues and contemporary applications as they're reading through.
Thank you. Junan?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your papers both. Richard, I have a question for you. Your ending particularly was quite provocative, and it's something as a medievalist I've had to do a lot of soul searching about, sort of. And I'm just wondering how you've navigated, because the fact is how you've navigated these issues. You know, I teach material that is white male. I mean, it's just the nature of the beast. There's a lot of material in medieval works that haven't been translated, and so on and so forth. It's not in any way suggesting that it's okay not to have that material, but I'm just wondering how you navigate this with your students in terms of, I tend to think that there's an essential excellence of the text itself, and what people have done with it is more the problem. And we can certainly, sort of address that. On the other hand, there is also the text itself coming out of certain kinds of societies. Do we hold them responsible for mindsets that I'm just wondering how you've navigated this, how you've thought about this, talked about this. I know it's a lot, but it's something that's been really in the back of my mind for a while.
Yeah, I think the short answer to how I navigate it is I'm learning to navigate it. And I agree entirely with what you just said. I do think that, there's an excellence in the text which stands apart from, this is exactly what Hume says. I mean, there's an excellence in the text. He calls it beauty, artistic merit, intellectual merit, which I think stands apart from all the other considerations. And that is what makes a text worth going back to. It's what makes it a core text. How the use it, I mean, point number one and point number two for Hume is, but if, you know, if there are certain kinds of moral defects in a text, which is, he says, are eternal blemishes. You know, they can't be waved away. And it's interesting that he uses the word bigotry several times in that very short essay. And I'm inclined to agree that it is indeed an eternal blemish. It doesn't necessarily mean we stop reading the text, but it just means that we need to be pretty blunt in our criticism or our analysis of it. And, you know, we may come to different conclusions. I mean, I think we, you know, can be far more comfortable with the anti-Semitism in the Merchant of Venice than we can with the anti-Semitism in the Jew of Malta. So, I mean, that's an important critical distinction. But I think if there's any sort of guiding, you know, thought I have as I teach these to students, it's to be as bluntly honest as possible.
Yeah.
Don?
Thank you. Yeah, that was.
Yeah, thank you for asking that good question.
Yeah, thank you. I actually wanted to ask a very similar question to Junan. But so I teach in Amsterdam, a very selected audience. But so of course the text you also said that your students are not very religious.
Not anymore. I mean, this is the most secular generation, right? So even though it's a Catholic school, they're not coming in that way. But yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, so I find that this is also, at least for me, that this is also a point of resistance. So of students, and I was wondering how you navigate that.
Yeah, I mean, not to quote Richard, but it is a kind of learning curve. And one of the things that I think when it comes to Dante, there's a certain understanding. He comes from a time and a place. There's a rhetoric there. Most of the students are willing to sort of accept the rhetoric. They, you know, as I tried to point out in my paper, I always have to qualify. So I'll say the words that Dante, of course, is densely salvific and Christian and so on. And sometimes I have to recalibrate a little bit for them. And I say, so if we don't have a God, if you don't have, you know, we sort of get, depending on which class, different discussions. So I try to reformulate. So think in terms of a journey towards human flourishing. Think in terms of a journey towards moral perspicacity. I mean, something that, you know, they could pull out of maybe a philosophical discourse or just a conversation about ethics and behaviors. And, you know, there is a certain amount, of course, from Dante that then gets lost, the idea of doing it for this kind of reason. But I think if I can, get them to think in terms of just kind of the larger questions and, you know, whether they have a foundation from which they can, sort of gather, gems and use that, or if it's just more the theology asks these questions and then their philosophy will kind of respond. I try to get them at least to think that way in terms of, I don't teach Dante. It's a core class and it's called Great Books and in the Catholic intellectual tradition. But, again, most of the students are no longer practicing Catholics. So, or they just, they're sort of socially Catholic. So the language they get for particularly the course I teach, which has a lot of early medieval and sort of early modern, has a lot of that language. And so they're ready for that. They distance themselves from it. They do lose some of the content. But if I can get them at least to think in terms of some of these larger questions, how do we engage the natural world? What is the human? What is it to be human? Is there a soul? And given that Christianity has some answers, they can at least springboard from that. Okay, so you don't agree with you know, Benedict or I don't know, Dante or someone or Gus, they mostly don't agree with Aquinas. So you don't agree with Aquinas on this. What can you know, what can we talk about? So it becomes sort of, for a lot of the students, the materials become more just kind of instruments to begin to ask some questions. I don't know about Europe. I don't have sort of a lot. I've reached a point, the generation I'm teaching is at a point where they're not even really hostile to religion anymore. It just isn't part of their lives. It's a very a-religious. Maybe 10 years ago, it might have been a little bit more sort of angry, you know, angry people, angry kids, resentful, rightly so or not, just, but now it's just more, oh yeah, that's just one way of thinking and I don't agree with it,
Right.
but I'll have, you know, I know how the language goes and I'll kind of use it that way.
Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah, so that's that kind of playing with that. But the other part of it is that I also teach a course on Chaucer, just to give you an insight, something that's maybe came up when Richard was speaking. I can't believe I'm thinking this again. And I was teaching one of the Canterbury Tales the other day. And, you know, Chaucer himself, which has a scene in it that's, if you pardon me, but it's about rape. And Chaucer himself was convicted of that. So we got into this really problematic discussion, but very, very good and very rich about, you know, does the character of the author begin to matter when they're writing about certain things? And, you know, these are not questions we answer easily. And of course, we don't really answer them fully in one place. But that's kind of the beauty of the material. So I don't know if that answered you, but that's kind of where I go with it.
Thank you.
Interesting. Michael, I think you're next. Unmute yourself. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. You can hear me now.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I used to use the expression "holy cow" as an expletive, you know, until I began teaching Hindu students, and I realized, no, I switched to "holy fish." Realized, of course, I've been 50 years in a Catholic institution, didn't realize that was a put down as well. What I say now is even more offensive, but universally offensive. In any case, my issue is this: as faculty, we curate the texts that we offer our students, and I think Hume's discussion, as you presented, is very helpful in terms of making those decisions. But let's look at it from the point of view of, I think, what they call reception theory. You know, what is the effect of this on our students? What are they hearing as opposed to what are the texts saying? I suspect that we need Hume to address this issue, the issue of perhaps levels of my dog is barking, of offensiveness. Excuse me a second. He hadn't barked the whole time. Yes, I think I made my question. How do we approach that issue, the reception issue?
To whom are you addressing this, Michael?
Sorry?
Just an open question for the reception, or anybody, please, who has a response to Michael's question about reception. I'd be eager to hear it.
It is a really hard topic, especially right now, because the world is kind of volatile right now. And students come in, I think, with a chip in the shoulder a lot of times. And so we just have to be really careful how we address certain things. And, you know, the grade books are difficult to work with sometimes because they are triggers for certain students considering their authorship, and then they don't understand the context. And then we have the situation where it can be kind of hard. And so sometimes I actually come in with something from the great books and I don't tell them who the author is at all. It's completely anonymous because I tend to get really good reactions for things that maybe otherwise I wouldn't. And so that's kind of what I do sometimes, but it is a really difficult thing. And as we navigate our students, you know, try to make it, I feel like I'm always like, how do you, like somebody who's like dodging the balls, you know, like, oh, okay, the student's reacting differently to this. And so I kind of always try to put not a Band-Aid on it, but, you know, avoid it the best that I can and misdirect and redirect. And I feel like a lot of times that's what I'm doing. And I'll come home and be like, oh, you know, like I dodged that bullet, but it is hard. It is a hard thing to be a professor in today's times, and for that reason.
My point is that in this era, we've come to become self-censoring with respect to those issues. And I'm not quite sure. Sometimes I feel like I've over-censored. Sometimes I feel like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. As you're saying, I'm not quite sure if anything, if there's a text that addresses that issue.
Yeah, that's a tough
Something that
question.
would open up the
Scott, you have a question or comment?
Well, it's a comedy question, commenty type of question. And I think both you and June Ann in different ways attest to this. To begin the question, the first part of the question is, it seemed to me at one point in your speech, June Ann, you were talking about what would be called the conversation, or more traditionally was spoken of as the conversation. Here's Dante using here's Dante using John. Here's Dante using Cicero. Here's that kind of thing. Of course, what matters is, from the student point of view, is that they've read it. Now, I think Martin Luther King's letter to Birmingham jail is a terrific kind of summary speech, which invokes this tradition, this rich tradition, and helps to constitute his speech. So part one of my question is, do the students pick up on how an author in front of them is using an author of the past? Do they comment on the differences between the texts or how they are being used? And that goes then, of course, to Rick's question and now Michael's discussion of this in terms of Jody's, Amy's question about how hard it is right now to speak in the classroom about very sensitive topics. So Hume kind of has an answer to this, which is to some degree what you're saying, Rick. Admit the bigotry that you find in these things, but at the same time, press forward and ask, why might these be worth attending to anyway?
Yeah, exactly, Scott. Couldn't.
Right.
We have 2 minutes left. So Phil, I want you to.
These conversations work together.
Phil? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Go ahead. You have your hand up.
I do.
Your electronic hand is up.
I know. Okay. Am I unmuted? Yes. Okay.
You're unmuted.
I want to propose a model of Alvo Pärt, who is an atheist, but his most beautiful, powerful compositions are on religious text. I have tried to think how that can be true. And one of the things I get from that is that what he is doing as a musician is bringing his audience to the text, not bringing the text to where the audience is. And that seems to me an important distinction. I think all three of you as speakers in some way or other are facing the problem of how to bring our text to the students as they are presently constituted, and leaving undone, as it were, the task of bringing our students to the text and letting the text, even if there are things in it that we perceive as biased or bigotry or somehow not as smart as we are, to bring them to that, to let them find out what the center of it is for themselves.
That sounds like St. John's.
I can't imagine how that could be.
But it's a wonderful suggestion, and maybe one of the hardest things to do. I think there are a few tasks that a professor has that are more difficult than sitting back and letting that happen. Well, we're just about out of time. Is there any final comment that somebody wants to offer before we close our session?
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you for coming. This was a learning experience for me. I appreciate your being here. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Good to see you again, Rick. Take
Hey,
care.
Michael.